They said the rain came before the truth did, that it swept through the cotton fields like a sermon too late to save anyone. Inside the plantation house, beneath a crooked cross and the whisper of oil lamps, a woman labored in secret. Her child would be born into silence, wrapped not in blessing but in sin. Upstairs, the colonel knelt by the window, thunder painting his face in flashes of guilt. Somewhere beyond the swamp, a cracked bell rang once, not to summon faith, but to mark the night when even God turned his gaze away. The rain did not begin. It arrived already in motion, already old, like a judgment that had been traveling for years to find this house. It slid down clapboard walls in narrow psalms, threaded the eaves with silver needles, and tapped the window panes as if counting sins. Lamp oil breathed its sweet, sleepy breath in the halls. The air tasted of iron and damp rope. Far off, the fields lay under a cotton sky, their white heads bowed as if the land itself were praying with its eyes closed. It was evening, but felt older than that, an hour past forgiveness. The wooden church stood 1 mile down the red road, a small ark stranded in a sea of mud. Its bell bore a hairline crack, a thin black smile that turned every toll into a wounded syllable. Between church and house stretched rows of cotton that looked, beneath lightning, like shrouds laid end to end. A hound barked twice and then swallowed its courage. Inside, the house worked at its remembering. Floorboards made their small confessions, creaks that sounded like names uttered too softly. A portrait of the colonel's father watched from the stair, as it had for decades. The eyes were painted to follow, and they did. On the mantel, a wooden cross leaned a breath to the left, its shadow long as a road you regret taking. Wax fell in slow ladders from the candles and hardened like resolutions no one keeps. He was called Colonel because the land preferred titles to names. War had once given him a grammar for power. Peace had given him ledgers and droughts and a widow-making son. His coat was black and polished thin at the elbows, a shine born of habit and worry. A ring of gold lived on his hand like a commandment he didn't know how to read anymore. He smelled faintly of tobacco leaf, wet leather, and the melancholy you pick up when walking alone. When he moved, the floor seemed to think about it first. He stood at the window, a man listening for news from a god who had stopped writing. Lightning stitched clumsy seams across the horizon. Thunder ripped them out again. A verse from childhood rose in his throat and found no place to settle. He pressed his ring to the glass until the cold taught him its small, clean language. Behind him on the table lay a Bible and a tumbler, clinging to the last amber ounce of his courage. She was called Ruth by those who dared love her in secret, and Girl by those who preferred the world simple. Her hands wore the scent of lye soap and cotton lint. The creases in her palms kept the geography of labor more faithfully than any map. Tonight the baby turned low, a slow tide inside her. She paused in the narrow passage where the house kept its quiet and counted the spaces between thunder, as if measuring the distance to safety. The dress she wore had been mended with 3 kinds of thread, white, gray, and the color of patience. Ruth moved by knowledge learned without books. How to kiss flame from a lamp without waking the room. How to step over the third board where it complains. How to gather breath deep in the ribs, so a body can be invisible. The night gave her its cool hand to hold. From the kitchen drifted a stew-thick smell of pork and bay leaf and wood smoke, a perfume of every supper-time sorrow. A draft ran the corridor's length and stroked her temples the way a mother might. She tasted rain on her lips, metal first, then something softer, a memory of wild mint crushed underfoot. The nursery waited behind a door kept shut. The wood smelled new, a scent out of place in a house built of old prayers. A cradle stood ready with linen folded tight, clean, white, and stubbornly innocent. In a drawer slept a silver rattle that had traveled across an ocean to be here, as if wealth itself believed it could absolve the future by arriving early. Ruth's hand hovered over the cradle's rail but did not settle. Touch changes the world. That is what touch knows. Down the stairs, the colonel's wife traced her rosary like someone learning the shape of absence. Pearls clacked softly. She had perfected the art of not hearing certain sounds. Still, the night had grown full enough that even practiced avoidance could not bless it quiet. Her face was pale in the lamplight, the color of surrender written carefully line by line. The storm's voice broadened until it seemed the house was breathing with it. Time slowed to the pace of a careful heartbeat. When a shutter slapped, it sounded like a reprimand. Somewhere a latch clicked, opened or closed, none could say. The walls, keepers of record, archivists of heat and argument and winter cough, made space for a new entry. 2 breaths, braided. He at the window did not turn when the stair gave a small sigh beneath a careful foot. But he knew the sound the way a sailor knows the sea, not learned, remembered. His reflection floated in the glass, a man unbuttoned from the assurances that used to hold him shut. He tried the name of Mercy and found it stiff in his mouth. He tried the name of Ruth and felt the room tilt. In the field, rain combed the cotton with a patient hand. In the church, a taper guttered and relit itself, so the watcher later swore. In the quarters, a lullaby rose that had no words a white ear would recognize, yet every syllable understood the price of tomorrow. The overseer sat under the eave of his shed, whittling nothing into less than nothing, a man who believed secrets were crops that could be harvested if you waited with a knife in your pocket. Ruth leaned her back to the cool plaster outside the nursery door and listened to the child swim. She imagined the body already learning 2 histories, neither of which would fit. Her mind went to the river she had crossed once as a girl. Low water and wide sky, the current saying softly, "Not yet, not yet." A prayer came that did not use the preacher's grammar. Let breath be longer than the night. Let feet find ground where there is mud. Let eyes open and find kindness somewhere. Upstairs, the colonel lifted the Bible with 2 fingers, as if it were a wounded animal, and set it down again. He spoke, not to the cross, not to the storm, but to the space between thunderclaps where truth sometimes dares to stand if you promise not to look straight at it. "Deliver me," he said, then corrected himself, voice a little smaller. "Deliver us." The house heard. Houses do. The cross upon the mantel adjusted its shadow, and the wax ladder lengthened by 1 rung. The air gathered itself into stillness, the way a choir hushes before the first note risks being music. In that stillness, a life knocked once from the inside. Far off, the cracked bell gave a single try at speaking sense into the weather. The sound came limping over the fields and found the windows and fell through them. Ruth and the colonel both closed their eyes at the same moment. The innocent syncopation of 2 people praying to be invisible and to be seen. Rain pressed its forehead to the glass. Thunder signed its name at the bottom of the sky. The cradle waited, and the night arranged its dark like vestments. The south, soft, stern, convinced, kept breathing, and in the breathing a secret found its first word. The rain broke at last, leaving the world rinsed but not clean. A low mist rose from the cotton rows and curled around the house as if to keep its secrets warm. The sun did not return, only a pale grey light that made every surface look uncertain of its color. The field steamed like the breath of sleeping beasts. The colonel sat on the porch, boots unpolished, shirt undone at the throat. His hands wrapped around a cup gone cold hours ago. He stared at the horizon where the fog ended and the memory began. The world felt smaller since the storm, as though heaven had moved a little farther away. Inside, the house worked to restore its rhythm, doors closing softly, servants sweeping up the night's wreckage. The faint sound of a hymn hummed under breath. From the kitchen came the smell of coffee and scorched bread. The mistress moved through the halls, hair pinned perfectly, rosary heavy in her pocket. Her eyes were dry, her smile careful. When Ruth appeared in the yard, hanging linens along the line, the sheets caught the breeze and turned into ghosts. Each one lifted and fell in the rhythm of breath. The colonel's gaze found her as naturally as shadow seeks the body. He told himself it was not desire, only curiosity, guilt's echo. But guilt has many disguises, and all of them look like remembering. He remembered the first time he had spoken her name without command in it. It had been a dry night, brittle with August. He'd found her near the well, filling buckets for the quarters. The air smelled of dirt and moonlight. He'd meant only to say, "Careful, the rope's frayed," but her eyes had lifted, and the moment split open like a fig. Later he would call it weakness. The preacher would call it sin, but in that breathless hour, it had felt like a kind of worship, a surrender before something older than language. The house had slept. The cross had looked away, and in the silence between thunder and breath, a life had begun its quiet climb toward tragedy. Now, months later, the weight of that night sat inside every prayer he tried to form. When he spoke the Lord's name, it came out hollow, as if echoing down an empty well. The mistress felt it too, though she did not yet know why. She found new reasons to pray, longer ones, softer. Ruth, meanwhile, carried her burden with a grace that frightened him. She never looked ashamed. Her hands worked, her voice stayed calm, her eyes met his only when duty demanded it. Yet every time he saw her pass under the shade of the magnolia tree, he felt something inside him kneel. The preacher came on Sunday, boots dusted white from the road. His voice filled the parlor like smoke, thick and righteous. "Temptation," he thundered, "does not whisper, it sings." The colonel's wife nodded until her pearls rattled. The colonel kept his head bowed, his palms damp. Ruth stood behind them serving tea. When she set the tray down, the preacher's eyes flickered briefly, knowingly. After the service, the colonel walked the preacher to the door. "She's quiet," the preacher said, glancing toward the kitchen. "She's obedient," the colonel replied too quickly. The preacher smiled the way a man smiles when he knows more than mercy allows. "Obedience," he murmured, "is often the prettiest disguise of rebellion." That night thunder returned, though the sky was clear. Ruth sat in the quarters, the child not yet born but already restless. She sang under her breath, a song older than America, older than chains. The other women pretended not to listen, but their hands slowed, their eyes glistened. In the big house, the colonel heard it through the open window, faint, trembling, beautiful. He rose from his chair, drawn by a sound he could not name. Down the hall, the mistress slept, one hand over her heart. The house breathed evenly. He stepped outside into the wet night. The air smelled of magnolia and repentance. Each step toward the quarters felt like a page turning in a Bible he no longer believed he could read. At the threshold, he stopped. Through the open window, he saw Ruth, her head bent over her stitching. A single candle lit her face, making her look carved from bronze and sorrow. She was humming still. The sound filled the dark like forgiveness pretending to be music. He wanted to speak, to ask her if she hated him, if she prayed for him, if she ever thought of that night as curse or blessing. But the words would not form. He only said her name softly. She looked up. Her eyes found him through the candlelight. She did not flinch, did not smile. "Go," she whispered. "Someone might see." He hesitated, and for a moment he believed that if he stepped closer, time would pause. Every clock, every storm, every judgment. But footsteps behind him ended the thought. The overseer, half drunk and watching from the yard, had seen. His grin was thin as wire. He tipped his hat, slow and mocking. "Evening, Colonel," he said, voice slick with mud. The colonel said nothing, but the look they shared was a promise, one both men would keep. Silence bought and sold. When he returned to the house, the storm finally broke. Rain pounded the roof like penance. In the cradle upstairs, empty still, the sheets moved with the draft, folding, unfurling, as though something unseen had drawn breath there. And in the small hours before dawn, when thunder walked away and the earth exhaled, the colonel whispered one line into the quiet. "Beneath the cross. Even mercy has its limit." Outside, lightning answered with no hesitation at all. Morning came thin and uncertain. A grey veil stretched over the land. The plantation smelled of wet ash and cotton sap. The air was quieter than usual, like a choir that had forgotten the next verse. The rain had left puddles the color of pewter, and the reflection in them made the house look like it was drowning upside down. The colonel's wife stood by the parlor window, her hands clasped around her rosary so tightly that the beads left bruises in her palms. She had not slept. Through the blur of dawn, she watched the servants move between the smokehouse and the yard, carrying buckets, wringing cloths. Each gesture was small and repetitive, the rhythm of lives forced into obedience. When Ruth passed by, a folded blanket pressed against her chest, the mistress's breath caught. She noticed the curve beneath Ruth's dress, gentle but undeniable. It was like hearing a hymn sung in the wrong key. Her lips parted, but no sound came. For a moment she thought perhaps she had imagined it, but the truth has a habit of standing still, waiting to be seen. Later, at breakfast, she said nothing. The colonel, pale and hollow-eyed, stirred his coffee and did not drink it. Their silence felt rehearsed. The sound of the spoon against porcelain was the only voice at the table. From somewhere upstairs came the faint cry of a baby bird in the chimney, or perhaps not a bird at all. By noon, whispers had begun. The quarters have their own gospel, spoken low, passed from hand to hand like contraband faith. Someone had seen the colonel visit the kitchen after dark. Someone else had heard the preacher ask strange questions. A midwife swore she had felt 2 heartbeats, where there should have been one. The words traveled fast, skipping from mouth to mouth, until even the overseer's smirk carried a new edge. The colonel knew before anyone told him. He could feel it. In the air, a heaviness that made breathing an act of confession. In the fields, the men bowed lower than usual. The women did not meet his eye. Every sound of labor seemed slower, more deliberate. The rhythm of the day had changed, as if the land itself was waiting to see what punishment would look like this time. That evening, the preacher arrived uninvited. The storm had returned, thin rain tapping at the windows like fingers counting seconds. The preacher's coat hung on his shoulders like the wings of a bird that had flown too far. His face glistened with rain, or maybe sweat. "I heard troubling things," he said. "Best to address sin while it's still small enough to fit inside a prayer." The colonel said nothing. The preacher's voice filled the room, each word measured like a psalm sung to the dead. "The Lord sees what man hides. He sees the fruit of disobedience even when born in darkness." Ruth was in the hallway then, standing just beyond the threshold, holding a pitcher of water. Her hands trembled so slightly it could have been the chill, but the preacher saw her. His eyes flickered once, cold and certain. He turned to the colonel. "You've let the devil set a table in your own house," he said softly. The colonel's jaw tightened. "Careful," he whispered. "You speak like a man who's never sinned." The preacher smiled the way wolves do, without teeth, but with promise. "I've sinned enough to recognize the scent." By the time the preacher left, the night had turned heavy as lead. The colonel sat before the fire, whiskey in one hand, Bible in the other. He read the same verse over and over. "The wages of sin is death," until the letters blurred into a pattern that looked like rain. Upstairs, Ruth's pains began early. She bit her lip to keep from crying out. Each contraction rolled through her like thunder in miniature. There was no one to call, no one she trusted enough to witness this birth. She had learned long ago that even kindness here had rules. When the baby came, it came quiet. A small warm bundle, neither white nor black, but something between. The color of dawn before the sun chooses its allegiance. Ruth held it against her chest and wept silently, not for shame, not even for fear, but for the knowledge that the world would never let this child belong anywhere. She whispered a prayer over it. The words came out soft, worn thin by use. "Lord, hide this one where the whip can't find him. Let his first word be freedom, even if his last breath isn't." Downstairs, the mistress could not sleep. A sound carried through the walls, faint, rhythmic, almost human. She rose, candle trembling in her hand. and followed it to the small storage room behind the kitchen. The door was ajar. Inside, she saw Ruth kneeling, the baby swaddled in her arms. The world stopped. For a moment, the mistress said nothing. Her candlelight painted them both. Ruth's dark skin glowing like polished wood, the child pale beneath its linen. The mistress's mouth opened, but her voice did not follow. Then she spoke. "Whose is it?" Ruth looked up, eyes glistening. "Mine," she said. The mistress stepped closer. "Whose else?" The pause was the kind that breaks more than it mends. From behind them, the colonel's voice came, low, cracked. "It's mine." The words were almost lost in the thunder, but not enough. The mistress turned. The candlelight shook. Her face was unreadable, a mask carved by every sermon she'd ever believed. "You brought sin into my house," she said. Her voice was quiet, the way calm water hides its depth. The colonel tried to step forward, but she raised her hand. "No, don't. I can't look at you and not see it." She left the room without another word. The door closed like a verdict. Ruth held the child tighter, rocking slowly. The colonel sank to his knees beside her. He reached for the baby's hand, but Ruth turned slightly away. "He'll never be free," she whispered. "Not here." Lightning struck close enough to shake the walls. The cross above the mantel fell, its chain snapping clean. Outside, the cracked bell rang once, though no wind had touched it. And in that single, trembling note, the sin was no longer secret. It had learned how to speak. The next morning came without birds. Even the sky seemed to keep its eyes closed. The storm had passed, but the air was heavy, swollen with aftermath. The plantation yard was a wound dressed in fog. Every tree looked like a witness that had promised silence. The mistress did not rise for breakfast. Her door remained shut, her prayers unfinished on the bedside table. The colonel sat alone at the long dining table, his reflection trembling in the black surface of his coffee. He could hear every sound in the house, the broom against the floor, the rustle of skirts, the faint cry of a child muffled by distance. Each one cut through him like a small repeated confession. By midday, the preacher returned, summoned this time not by faith but by shame. His horse steamed in the yard. His coat was slick with rain. He carried his Bible as if it were a weapon. When the mistress met him at the door, her face was pale, her lips bloodless. "There's a child," she said simply. "It bears his likeness." The preacher's mouth tightened into something like victory. "Then the house must be cleansed," he replied. They went together to the colonel's study. He stood at the window again, as though hoping for a message written on the horizon. When they entered, he didn't turn. "Brother," the preacher said, voice low, "the wages of sin don't," the colonel interrupted. His voice was soft but sharp enough to draw blood. "Don't preach to me about wages. I've paid them in sweat and silence my whole life. Then pay this one in repentance," the colonel turned. His eyes were red, not from tears but from sleeplessness. "Repentance for what? For love, for weakness, for wanting to be seen?" The preacher's gaze did not waver. "For forgetting who you are." Silence stretched until it became a wall between them. Then the mistress spoke. "She must go, and the child with her." The colonel's shoulders dropped as though someone had placed a cross upon them. "And where will she go?" "Anywhere but here," she said. "God will find her elsewhere. He no longer lives in this house." Outside, the overseer waited by the wagon, his hat pulled low. The air smelled of mud and hickory smoke. Ruth stood nearby, holding the child. The bundle in her arms stirred once, then went still again, dreaming without knowing it had begun life as a scandal. When the colonel stepped onto the porch, Ruth did not look up. The preacher stood to one side, murmuring a psalm that sounded more like a spell. The mistress watched from the doorway, her rosary gleaming faintly in the gray light. "Do it quickly," she said. Ruth adjusted the blanket around the child. Her fingers moved gently, reverently. There was no plea in her eyes, only exhaustion and something older than grief. a knowledge passed down through too many generations to have a name. The colonel took a step forward, but the preacher raised a hand. "Let her go," he said. "Do not defile yourself again." The colonel ignored him. He reached into his pocket and drew out a small silver cross, the one that had once hung over the mantel. "Take this," he said to Ruth. For him, Ruth hesitated. "He won't need it," she whispered. "God already knows him." Their eyes met, one last moment suspended between sin and forgiveness. Then the overseer cracked the reins, and the wagon jolted forward. The wheels cut deep into the wet red clay, leaving scars that the next rain would only deepen. The colonel watched until the fog swallowed them. Only then did he feel how cold the morning had become. That night, thunder came again, distant and deliberate. The colonel sat by the hearth, staring into the fire until it blurred. The mistress entered without speaking, her face lit by the flames. She set a folded letter on the table. "It's done," she said. "The preacher has seen to it. He'll tell the congregation that God's justice was served." The colonel's mouth twisted. "Justice?" "Yes." Her voice trembled once, then steadied. "It was mercy that spared her life." He stood slowly, his shadow climbing the wall behind him. "You call exile mercy?" "I call it what I can live with." He took the letter and tore it in half. "Then live with this too." For a heartbeat she looked frightened. Then she turned and left, closing the door with the finality of a gravestone. Outside, wind scraped the shutters. In the distance, dogs began to howl, long, mournful, and wrong. The colonel walked to the window. Through the rain-streaked glass, he thought he saw a figure standing by the old oak near the stables. A woman holding a child. Lightning flared and she was gone. He didn't sleep. Near dawn, a sound woke him, a sharp crack like the world exhaling. He rushed to the window and saw the oak struck by lightning, burning from the inside out. The fire glowed blue in the rain, beautiful and impossible. The preacher came later that morning. The air still smelled of smoke. The colonel met him at the door. "She's gone," the preacher said. The colonel nodded. The preacher held out his hand for a prayer, but the colonel stepped back. "No more words," he said. "You and I serve different gods now." After the preacher left, the colonel went to the nursery. The cradle was empty, the sheets folded smooth. He sat on the floor, the cross Ruth had refused clutched in his palm. When the candlelight touched the silver, it flared briefly, then dulled again, as though heaven itself had blinked. He whispered into the emptiness. If God turned his face away, maybe he did it to keep from weeping. The house gave no answer, but somewhere in its bones a board sighed as if agreeing. By the next evening, the mistress had left for her sister's estate. The servants moved quietly, their eyes lowered. The colonel remained alone, a ghost haunting his own name. Every night thereafter, when the rain came, he would open the door and stand in it until he was soaked through. It was not penance, it was remembrance. And sometimes when thunder rolled low across the fields, he thought he heard a woman singing, a lullaby too soft for the living, too kind for the dead. Winter arrived early that year, though the South does not often know how to be cold. The air grew thin and metallic, and every sound carried too far. Frost crawled over the windows at dawn, tracing veins like old handwriting. The fields, stripped bare of cotton, looked like white shrouds forgotten after the funeral. The colonel rarely spoke now. The house had learned to live without his voice. His boots no longer struck the floor with purpose, but drifted through the halls like the echo of a memory, too stubborn to leave. The servants moved around him the way people move around statues, reverent, cautious, pretending not to see that the marble had begun to crack. He spent his mornings in the church down the road, sitting not in the front pew but the last, where the air smelled of mildew and regret. The new preacher, a younger man with soft eyes and sharp sermons, often found him there long after service ended. He would ask gently, "Colonel, what keeps you?" The colonel would answer, "A promise I can't remember breaking and a sin I can't remember stopping." He lit candles one by one, until the altar looked like a small city burning. Their wax dripped onto his hands and hardened there like new skin. When the last flame died, he would whisper, "Still here," as if reminding God not to forget him entirely. At night, he returned to the plantation house that had once belonged to both the living and the proud. Now it belonged to silence. Each room breathed its own temperature, its own kind of ghost. In the nursery, the air was always colder by a few degrees, as if morning itself had taken up residence. The cradle remained, though the mistress had wanted it burned. He couldn't. It was the only thing that still made sound, a faint creak whenever the wind slipped through the window frame, a heartbeat carved into wood. He would sit there staring at it until sleep found him in the chair like a punishment. The first time he saw Ruth again was not in a dream but in the flesh, or what passed for it. The night was thunderless but restless. The lanterns had gone out for no reason at all. He woke to the sound of humming, soft and steady, coming from the hall outside his room. It was the same song, the one she used to hum when hanging linens, when cooking, when trying to calm the unborn child that turned inside her like a question without answer. He rose and followed it. The floorboards made no protest. The hallway stretched longer than it ever had before. Every candle extinguished except the one flickering at the far end. When he reached the nursery door, the song stopped. Inside, a faint glow moved through the dark, not from flame but from something softer, like light remembered rather than made. Ruth stood there, or her echo did, her figure wrapped in the outline of old candlelight. In her arms was the child, quiet, swaddled in linen that did not cast a shadow. The colonel's breath faltered. "Ruth," he whispered, and the name broke apart on his tongue. She turned her face toward him, not angry, not forgiving, simply aware. The child stirred, and she shifted her weight as if it were real. Her voice came low, nearly soundless. "He still waits for your prayer." The colonel took one step forward, then another. "I have no prayers left." Ruth tilted her head. "Then give him silence. God listens there too." Her figure began to dim, fading like a reflection on still water disturbed by a single ripple. The colonel reached out, desperate to hold on, but his hand met nothing but air that smelled faintly of milk and iron. When the light vanished, only the cold remained. He fell to his knees before the cradle. For the first time since that night months ago, he wept. He wept until his throat rasped, like the hinge of a door left open too long. When he finally slept, his dreams were simple. A field of cotton glowing beneath moonlight, and a woman's voice singing to something beyond reach. From then on, the house changed. Candles refused to stay lit past midnight. The bell at the church, once cracked and silent, began to ring on its own whenever storms gathered. Servants whispered of a lullaby threading through the rain, of soft footsteps that stopped at the cradle and went no farther. The mistress returned briefly, years later, to collect what pride she still owned. She found the colonel older, smaller somehow, his hair white as salt. The house felt colder around him, as though his shadow gave off frost. "Have you prayed?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Every day." "Sometimes the prayers answer," she frowned. "And what do they say?" He looked toward the window where rain had begun again, thin, deliberate. "They say forgiveness sounds a lot like footsteps leaving." That night after she left, the colonel returned to the nursery. The storm pressed against the windows, thunder rolling across the horizon like distant drums. He lit a single candle and placed it beside the cradle. "I will not ask you to come again," he said into the empty room. "But if you do, I will not turn away this time." The candle flickered, though there was no breeze. He closed his eyes and began to hum, not her song, but one that echoed its shape. The tone trembled, found steadiness, and grew. Outside, the wind softened. The rain slowed to a whisper. The servants swore that by dawn every candle in the house had burned down to the same small pool of wax, each one extinguished at exactly the same moment. The colonel was found kneeling beside the cradle, head bowed, his hands clasped around the small silver cross Ruth had refused to take. His lips were parted as if still whispering, The fire had gone cold, but his body was warm, as though something had just let go. And when they carried him from the room, they said the cradle rocked once more by itself, just once, and then was still. Outside, the church bell rang on its own, clear and full for the first time since that night of exile. The sound drifted over the valley and faded into the mist, leaving behind a silence that did not feel empty, but finally forgiven. They say the house still stands, though time has chewed its corners and memory has made it taller than it ever was. The shutters hang crooked. The porch slants like an old hymn sung off key. In the right kind of rain, it smells of candle smoke and old prayers. Ivy has swallowed most of the bricks, patient as forgiveness. But the windows still stare out toward the cotton fields, as if waiting for a storm to return. Travelers who pass that way claim that on certain nights, when the thunder gathers low and deliberate, you can see a single candle burning in the upstairs window. It flickers for a moment, then steadies, the same way a heartbeat does after grief learns to breathe again. Some swear they hear a lullaby carried on the wind, faint but certain, moving through the fields like a mother's hand across the face of a sleeping child. The townsfolk do not speak the colonel's name anymore. The preacher's records burned in a flood. The mistress was buried far away under her maiden name, her grave marked only with the word peace. But the story lives in whispers, passed from porch to porch, the tale of a man who prayed for silence and received it, and a woman who walked through rain carrying mercy in her arms. In the churchyard, the bell that once split from thunder still hangs, a scar of bronze cold to the touch. And yet on nights when the wind moves just right, it trembles. Not a full ring, only the smallest vibration, like a sigh that escaped God's throat. If you listen closely, you might hear it too. A single sound, old as guilt, soft as grace, a reminder that even in the deep south, where sin and faith once shared the same roof, not every haunting asks for vengeance. Some only ask to be remembered.